I'd like to invite Dr. Vidya Yerodekar, Pro-Chancellor SIU, to welcome our speakers.
So thank you, Anita. Once again, we start with a wonderful morning on this lovely Sunday. It's also sunny in Pune. The rains have stopped. And yesterday was a wonderful day with excellent speakers. And today, one after the other, you had just Shekhar Gupta talking to us. And now we have none other than the Mr. Pavan Verma, who again we see so often on television. For me and Rajiv, my husband, Pavanji and Renuji are dear friends. And we've had the opportunity of staying at the India estate when he was the ambassador in Bhutan, which is a beautiful, beautiful country and great hospitality. So thank you, Pavanji, for all this. We keep inviting him to Symbiosis, but again, now with his political career as well as his, academic scholarly career that he has, he doesn't find time. And so this time we felt that he has to come here virtually. And I'm so happy, Pavanji, that you accepted our invitation to join this virtual Symbiosis Literary Festival of 2 days. As I've already discussed with you, this is the Symbiosis Golden Jubilee year, and Dr. Muzumdar sir established Symbiosis 50 years ago. And we are so happy that, this virtual festival is really applauded so well by not only our students, academia, but people from all across India, as well as our alumni from all across the world. So without taking much time, I will request Dr. Muzumdar sir also to say a few words. Pavanji is visiting virtually Symbiosis after many years. Thank you.
Namaste Pavanji, namaste sir. Welcome to Symbiosis again. I'm really happy that you have spare time to participate in this webinar. As you know, we started Symbiosis way back in 1971 to promote the friendship between foreign and Indian students. It was a small organization then, and now it has flowered into a beautiful university with campuses in so many states of our country. Sir, I must also tell you that I enjoyed reading your book on Shankaracharya. And one wonderful thing which I noticed in the book was, and which I never knew, that Shankaracharya spent few months in Trambakeshwar at Nashik, and it was there that he studied under some Pandit in Trambakeshwar. It was really an exciting reading for me, and thank you for giving to us a wonderful book on Shankaracharya. Thank you, sir, and welcome to Symbiosis again.
I must make a special mention here. Of course, Latika is going to have the conversation with Pavanji, but I must make a mention of late Shri Dilip Padgaonkar, who was an advisor, a friend, a philosopher, and a guide to Symbiosis, and a dear friend of Pavanji. And Latika, we cannot forget Dilip's contribution to Symbiosis as the first chair professor, the R.K. Lakshman chair that he held. So we still remember him, and his memories are very, very deep in all our activities at Symbiosis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the sculpture of R.K. Lakshman outside the window, and he's also wearing a mask. Well, it's past noon, distinguished guests and friends and students and all ladies and gentlemen who are here at this webinar. I wish you a good afternoon and a big welcome to this discussion with Pavan Verma. It's a great pleasure, and shall I say delight, Pavan, to be talking to you. You who have worn so many hats, different hats in your lifetime, tall hats, impressive hats, colorful hats, varied hats, I must say. You've had a career in the Indian Foreign Service, you've been ambassador in different countries, you're also director of the Nehru Center in London. And then after retirement, your life took a totally different turn. You joined the JDU, you were with Nitish Kumar, you were chief secretary there also, you were with the Rajya Sabha also. And in the midst of this extraordinarily crowded life, which was extremely demanding because it just went from one to the other, you found the time not to write one or two, but almost 12, 15 books, an amazing number of books, a lot of them on Hinduism, on Krishna, on Yudhishthira and Draupadi, on Chanakya, on Adi Shankaracharya, and now the latest on Lord Ram. So it is just amazing. You've also translated poetry of different poets. I think Gulzar also you've translated, Ghalib also you've translated. You have done a lot of literary work in your life. And then you have also received honorary doctorates, and you've received the major award in Bhutan from none less than the king himself. So today I will be speaking to you on Shankaracharya, Adi Shankaracharya, Hinduism's greatest thinker. May I just begin by saying that it's an invigorating, stimulating, and an utterly readable book on a subject that's very complex. But you, Mr. Pavan Verma, have retained that complexity of thought, but put this in a language which an interested person understands. So thank you for bringing Shankaracharya. So should we begin?
Yes, I'm ready.
I would like to take the course that your book has taken. You begin by saying, first you have followed Adi Shankaracharya's spiritual journey, you followed his intellectual journey, but you have also physically followed the journey that he gave himself throughout the length and breadth of this land. You know, he as a little child walking to all parts of India, from southern part of India, Kerala, Kalari, where he was born, you went there. And then you went to Omkareshwar, you went to the cave where he met his guru, and you went to Kashi, and you went to all the mutts that he established, and you went to Srinagar. You went absolutely everywhere. You didn't walk, agreed, like he walked, or you took a plane, whatever it is, but you did do that. And so you went to all these places, you spoke to people who are scholars of Hinduism, you spoke to people who are teachers, you spoke to people who are cultural activists, as you call them, and you also spoke to people who have, strangely, written about and thought about the cosmic geometries and the sacred journeys of Kashi. Now, my first question to you is, has this been a very personal journey for you? What has it meant to you? Did it do something to you? Were you stimulated spiritually, or what was it? Because you even speak about a place like Kashi, where there's frenetic activity in a place which is a repository of death. So, you know, all these contradictory things, what has it meant for you personally?
Well, first of all, thank you, Latika. And let me say what a great pleasure it's talking to you. You and Dilip Gaonkar-ji have been very old and good friends. And so it's a great pleasure to be talking to you. And I want to thank Symbiosis, Dr. Mazumdar, Dr. Vidya Yeravadkar, not only friends, but for whom I have great affection and respect, and to congratulate them on the golden jubilee of this remarkable and great university which they have nurtured and built up. So let me begin first by expressing my respect and my gratitude. Now to your question. Let me say to you that I am prompted to write on Hinduism because I believe there is a great deal of pervasive ignorance about Hinduism among Hindus. That is the paradox. You see, Hinduism is a religion, a spiritual outlook which is Anadi, Anant, Sanatan. It has continued over millennia. And because we don't have only one God, because we don't have only one book, because we don't have only one church, because we don't have only one prescriptive ritual, very often we are practicing Hindus who go on with our lives without knowing the remarkable grandeur, the sheer audacity of thought of this great religion. And I believe that to know more about our religion, if we are Hindus and even if we are not, becomes all the more important today when there are narratives which seem to tell us that what we say alone is Hinduism. So unless we are informed, and I say this particularly to the students, unless we have a curiosity, a sense of exploring once again what this great spiritual legacy and religion stand for, we are likely to be deprived of a great treasure house and also all the arguments that we need to rebut inaccurate, shallow, superficial interpretations of this great religion. So, of course, for me, it is both a mission and a personal journey. And that personal journey began long years ago. But when I was writing Adi Shankaracharya, I was surprised to find when I finished the book, Latika, that a great many people, and among them a great many of the young, when they read this book, until they read it, they didn't know who Adi Shankaracharya was really. When he was born. What did he write? What is Hinduism about? Of which part of Hinduism's 6 systems of philosophy was he the most remarkable proponent? People don't know. Let me say to you that I took a personal journey from Kaladi to Kedarnath. Because no one knows that when he was born in the 8th century in 788, he was born in a small village called Kaladi in Kerala near Cochin. And he died at the age of 32. And in this short life, he walked from Kaladi to the places you have mentioned, all across India, and he took his final samadhi at Kedarnath. So you can imagine what a remarkable feat it must have been for a philosopher. And it is also incidentally a geographical definition of Bharatvarsh. Where did he establish his 4 mutts? I was curious. So one is in Sringeri in the south, one is at Dwarka in the west, one is at the eastern fringe of India in Puri, and one is at Joshimath, which is the base for the climb to Badrinath right in the north. So you have the civilizational map of India in the 8th century AD or CE, when the Britishers actually nurtured the myth that they created India. So India is a very ancient and old civilization. But what did Shankaracharya represent? Please understand, and I speak this to your students. Hinduism began, for instance, if please read the Nasidiya Sukt of the Rig Veda. It began with an intellectual query. What is this world about? What is this bewildering plurality of the cosmos? Who are we? What is the truth? And then you had not one, 6 systems of Hindu philosophy. The Nyaya, the Vaisheshik, the Sankhya, the Yoga, the Purv Mimansh, and the Uttar Mimansh. Now, what is common about all these 6 systems of Hindu philosophy, about which most Hindus don't even know? All of these 6 schools of Hindu philosophy were not talking about God. You must understand the grandeur of this intellectual legacy. They were asking what could be the ultimate truth. They were not defining divinity. They were exploring the frontiers of the possibility of truth. And that is what has distinguished Hinduism from the very beginning, with often other religions which are equally great. But Hinduism began by the search for truth, not for deity and not for ritual. And that is why Adi Shankaracharya, although born thousands of years after the Rig Veda, continued that tradition. Do you know, Latika, why I say you have to understand this legacy? In Hinduism, there is no prescriptive fiat. There is no diktat. No one in Hinduism has been burnt on the stake for heresy. There is no blasphemy. Hinduism has relied on dialogue. Please understand that the Upanishads, which are one of the 3 foundational texts of Hinduism, the Upanishads, They are in the nature of a dialogue, where the Shishya asks the Guru about what could be the truth or any other question, and the Guru does not say this is it. He indicates, he encourages the student to think, he alludes, he prompts a thought. Take another text. I'm talking of the three foundational texts of Hinduism, because our discussion today is conversations on Hindu philosophy. Take another text. Take the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is again a dialogue where Krishna and Arjun try to discover what should be the right course of action for an ordinary human being when presented with multiple choices. That is the dilemma. We face it in everyday life. And what does Krishna tell Arjun? He spells out what should be the right response. What he calls Nishkam Karma. Duty without a sense of reward, which incidentally is a great ethic to live life by. But he does not say do it. At the end he says to Arjun, this is what I think. Now you must decide what you must do. That is the dialogue and the decision-making process of Hinduism. Take another text, the third foundational text of Hinduism, the Brahma Sutras. Now, a lot of your students would not even have heard of the Brahma Sutras. But it's a remarkable text. Each stanza is an aphorism, so condensed that it was said that if it could be even more condensed, shortened, beyond the just 3 words, it gives the same pleasure as a son being born in the family. A son or a daughter, let me add, in today's time. So, the Brahma Sutras, the commentary that Shankaracharya wrote on it, and other commentaries, before they present their interpretation of it, they put into that text the opponent's point of view. So all of the commentary is about what is the other side before the final conclusion is presented. So this is the background of Hinduism of which Adi Shankaracharya ji is a part. And by the way, he is the proponent of Advait Hinduism, which is the Uttar Mimamsa school of the 6 systems of Hindu philosophy, which I mentioned to you. The whole notion of an all-pervasive cosmic consciousness called Brahm pervading the universe, which is who we are. And that consciousness is unalloyed joy, bliss, and awareness. And we need to realize that.
Thank you, Pawan. Well, you've already answered some of the questions that I had in mind. So I'll go on to another one. You spoke about Hinduism not having a fiat. It is not compelling you to think this way or act that way. So the whole idea is discussion and debate. And this is something in which Adi Shankaracharya also took part. He also debated with people, discussed with people, and not just with men. He even discussed with women. In fact, one of the very interesting incidents that you recount is his discussion with Vandana Mishra, and then with Vandana Mishra's wife. And the wife asked him questions on karma, of which Adi Shankaracharya knew nothing. So apparently it is said that he got out of his body and went into another body and actually experienced karma, so much so that he had to be pulled back. He didn't even want to leave it, to come back into his own body and then discuss karma with Vandana Mishra's wife. He also spoke to a woman about Shakti. So can you tell us a little bit about his debates and discussions with people as he moved ahead and in the process learned himself also?
You see, again I want to say this to our young students. The more superficial your knowledge of Hinduism, the more simplistic your diktat will be, as we are seeing happening today in some quarters. They will say this is right and that is wrong, and no discussion further on this issue. It's a travesty. It's a deliberate devaluation. It's reducing Hinduism to the lowest common denominator of intellectual understanding. Adi Shankaracharya believed in what is called Shastrarth, Samvad, civilized discourse, Sabhya Samvad, an art which is dying today, which we don't see. And we see the least on television programs in which I also participate. So it is a dying art. But look again at the legacy to which we are heir. The tool employed by Adi Shankaracharya was Sabhya Samvad. Now, in the pursuit of this, in order to propagate or convince others of his own ideology, he had a dialogue with those who oppose him. Now, what was this opposition about? Please understand the basics. Adi Shankaracharya believed in the Advait school, which believed in the power of knowledge. Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahm. To put it in a nutshell, the truth is knowledge and Brahm is eternal and Anant. So according to him and according to the Advait school, nothing else matters except the pursuit of knowledge which may take you closer to understanding the ultimate reality of Brahm, which is unsullied, pervasive, pure consciousness pervading the entire universe, whose inferential experience, if you ever have Brahm Anubhav, if you ever are tuned, your antenna is tuned to that Brahm, is unblemished bliss, joy and awareness, where you see reality for what it is, rather than the reality which you take to be more important, which is the empirical world we live in. Why does that happen? It happens because of a dosha, an error of perception in our mind. We take the transient and the impermanent as real and ignore that which is eternal, Anant and Anadi, which is part of us. So what are the three Mahavakyas of the Upanishad? Tat Tvam Asi, that thou art. Not this, that thou art. Ayam Atma Brahm, the Atma within you, that consciousness which is constantly observing, that self within you is the same as that universal consciousness which is Brahm. And the third Mahavakya, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahm. So that is the basis on which Adi Shankaracharya proceeds, and he says, by correct knowledge, you will overcome your ignorance and understand the true nature of the reality, and thus be privy to that great bliss which is your inherent right and which constitutes your being. In a nutshell, I can elaborate on it for hours. Now, what was Mandan Mishra's? What was Mandan Mishra's philosophy? And this is what the freedom Hinduism permits. Mandan Mishra was a great proponent of the Purva Mimamsa philosophy, which is also known as Karma Kand. According to that, following the prescribed rituals as laid down in the Shruti texts, the Dharma Shastras and the Manusmriti, etc. In other words, following prescribed ritual is the best path forward, as against Adi Shankara's path of knowledge. Now, between these two great giants, both of them great intellects, What was the way to resolve the problem? It is not that a gun was taken and one shot or the other. It is not as if the one said to the other, you are an unredeemed idiot, and abuse followed. I say this in the context of our times because this is how debates are being conducted today. Adi Shankaracharya journeyed to Mandan Mishra. Mandan Mishra initially, because he was busy with the ritual, was reluctant to meet him. Adi Shankaracharya persuaded him. Let's have a dialogue. Let us discuss. And he agreed. And they sat down. And they had a dialogue that went on for days, if not weeks. And in the age where there was the absence of Wi-Fi, internet, and social media, by word of mouth, it was as if in the 8th century, all of Hindu India was watching or learning about that debate. And guess who was the empire of that debate? Look at the civilized nature of our legacy. Adi Shankaracharya said to Mandan Mishra, your wife Ubhay Bharti can be the referee. He did not assume that she will be partial to or less than impartial. It was taken that she, being a scholar herself in her own right, she will judge impartially, and so she was the empire of the debate. And so a debate took place in which Mandan Mishra conceded defeat to Adi Shankaracharya, and it was being agreed that whoever loses will become the follower of the other. But then Ubhay Bharti said, I am one part of my husband, Ardhanarishwar. Remarkable concepts in Hinduism. Shiva and Parvati, on that I can give a separate talk of Purush Prakriti, the Shakti notion. I am one part of my husband, as he is one part of me. If he has lost, you have to debate with me. And then she said that I will debate with you about kama, desire, sensuality. Now, Adi Shankaracharya was a born sannyasin. He had renounced life, and this was an area about which he had little knowledge. But so the story goes, as lores and mythology develop, that Adi Shankaracharya could not say no to the debate. He sought time. And then there is an extra psychological experience that happened where he became incarnated in the body of a dead prince who was about to be cremated. The dead prince got revived miraculously, and so Shankaracharya went back to the palace in the form of that dead but now revived prince and experienced the bhoga of kama in the palace with the princesses' wives, and came back fully knowledgeable about it and debated with Ubhay Bharti, won that debate, and both of them became his follower. In fact, the most prominent followers of Adi Shankaracharya. Now you will ask me, the students will ask me, अरे भाई कहाँ spirituality, कहाँ religion, कहाँ knowledge, कहाँ karma kand, where does calm come in? But that again, Latika, is part of the Hindu worldview. What are the 4 Purusharthas of Hinduism? Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. So, dharma or right conduct, which can also be relative as defined by situations. We are not diktats with, say, 10 commandments only. It's a remarkable, separate chapter discussing dharma in Hinduism. What is right and what is wrong. Artha, the pursuit of material well-being. It is conjoined that in your stage, as a householder, the 4 stages of a Hindu life, brahmacharya, grahas, vanpras, sannyas. As a householder, you are conjoined for the upkeep of your family to acquire material gain in conformity with dharma. And what is calm? the pursuit of the sensual, the philosophical acceptance of desire as part of the balanced life. So if you take a book like the Kama Sutra, Vatsyayan has written it, and by the way, he was a sage, a rishi.
Yeah.
Now you will think, and many people in the world will think, because they see only the illustrations, that the Kama Sutra is only a book about impossible postures. However, it is a book which is part and in sync with the philosophy of Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. So Vatsyayan is asked in the first chapter, why do we need this book? Again a dialogue. Somebody is asking Vatsyayan, अरे भाई किताब लिखी है, इसकी जरूरत क्या है? Then Vatsyayan explains that the four purusharths are dharma, artha, kama, moksha, and each of the first three pursued in proportion and not in exclusion. Please follow my words carefully. In other words, if you only pursue kama, or if you only go after material gain, it's wrong, because it is not part of a balanced life. The goal is a balanced life. So where without hypocrisy, dharma, artha, material pursuit, and kama is included, but each must be pursued in proportion and not in exclusion. And if that is done as part of the natural evolution of that balanced life, you will reach the fourth stage, which is moksha. Now, this is the Hindu worldview, a remarkably pragmatic, insightful, and balanced view. So when you see moral policemen going around, harassing young couples in parks, and saying this is against Hindu tradition, they don't have a clue. They don't have a clue. They are repeating Victorian morality to us, without understanding the sheer grandeur of thought and vision of Hinduism itself. This is the tragedy, the irony of our new moral pundits who know nothing. Do you know about the lore of Radha and Krishna? Do you know that Shiva and Parvati gambled together in eternal love play? And the same Shiva could go into centuries of meditation. There are, Hinduism encompasses contradictions and harmonizes them. So in that context, Adi Shankaracharya also learnt about Kama, but it was to convey the principle that Kama also has philosophical validity, but in balance and proportion.
Right. Pavan, I would like to ask you something that apparently happened to Adi Shankaracharya around the same time, and that is about caste. Now, he met someone, I think you can narrate that incident about meeting that Chandal and what kind of response he got from that person who was of a low caste. And you do say that, in fact, Adi Shankaracharya did not believe in the caste system. But you also write, and that is what I want to question you on, that he may have fought shy of putting his non-dualism into practice because it might have brought about a social revolution and shaken the foundations of the caste system. So this I found slightly contradictory. Maybe you can clear this contradiction. Because he was so firm about his belief in Advaita, then in that case, how was he not firm enough to propagate the non-existence of the caste system?
I want to say a little, as briefly as I can, on this. Where did the caste system originate? According to scholars, it originated with the Purusha Sukta hymn in the Rig Veda, which said that the Brahmins are the mouth, the hands are the Kshatriyas, the feet, the Vaishyas emerge from the thighs, and then the Shudras from the feet. But it's interesting to note that if you read the Purusha Sukta hymn, there is no prescription of non-negotiable hierarchy in these four categories. It was a Varna system based on functionality, not a jati system then. And according to the latest DNA studies carried out, incidentally, not in India but abroad, on which brilliant books have been written, including Tony Joseph's books, Early Indians, for at least 2000 years, there was no prescriptive endogamy in the caste system. In other words, dining was permitted, intermarriages were permitted, Shudras could become the role. Who has written, for instance, the Ramayana? Valmiki, born of a Shudra mother. Even Ved Vyas, the fisherwoman's son, unknown father. So people could be rishis and not belong to Brahmins. So for 2000, but with the coming of the not Smriti, which are considered to be revealed texts like the Upanishads, but with the coming of the common era, first, second century, the Dharma Shastras and the Manusmriti was written by human beings, which introduced a highly condemnable and pernicious and malevolent element of oppression and discrimination as sanctified by a caste system based not on vocation but birth. And it became a very established parampara, leading to a great deal of suffering then and continued suffering today. This is the background. Adi Shankaracharya, please remember, was a philosopher. He was not a reformer. With the Bhakti movement that came after the 12th century CE, there was social reform. Whether it is Kabir or whether it is Guru Nanak or whether it is Mirabai or whether it is Andal or whether it is Surdas, they upended caste hierarchies. They questioned them. But at that time when Adi Shankaracharya was lived, the caste system was very much entrenched. Now, what did Adi Shankaracharya do when he was in Kashi and a Chandal, person from the lowest caste, in a narrow gully or alleyway, came in his presence? So his followers tried to remove the Chandal from his path for the possibility of pollution as the caste system, untouchability. It is said, and I write this about in my book, that Adi Shankaracharya ji on the spot composed one of his shortest stotras called the Manisha Panchakam, where he spontaneously said, Chandalostu sa, tu dvijostu, Gururishya Manisha Mama. Anyone who understands the all-pervasive unity of Brahm, which is in you and which is in me, and which is blemishless, be he or she a Chandal or any Brahmin or anyone else, for me that person is a Guru. And he says, Manisha Mama, that is not what I think, that is my resolve. So obviously he tried to interface the basic concept of his philosophy with social practice. But his main pursuit was the pursuit of truth, not the changing of society. In his one of the most famous stotras, if you know the Nirvana Shatakam, Chidananda Rupa Shivoham Shivoham.
Yes.
In that he writes, Na main mrityu shanka, na main jati bheda. I don't believe in this. In fact, this is the freedom that Hinduism gives. He says, na punyam, na papam, na sokhyam, na dukkham, na mantro, na tirtham, na vedo, na yagna. There is no mantra. There is no tirth. There are not even the Vedas. There is no yagna. This is blasphemy. He would have been burnt on the stake in any other religion. He said, all that matters is chid, awareness, chidanand, joy. Again blasphemy. I am Shiva. I am Shiva. He assumed that he himself is God because there is no difference between God and me because we both represent the same Brahm.
Yes. But taking off from what you're saying here, this idea of complete awareness, of pure consciousness. I think you have also suggested in your book that maybe this idea is a bit too dry and difficult for a common man to understand and much less to move towards. Hence, the second strand of Hinduism, which is theism, which is a personalized God, which also happened, which actually Shankaracharya did not accept. But finally, he did say, I will make space for this personalized God, so that in worshipping a personalized God, you actually make yourself space to journey towards that particular consciousness which is required to attain moksha.
You see, Adi Shankaracharya believed in this cosmic consciousness, which you rightly said, was perhaps for normal people much too dry a concept. Although when you meditate, Latika, and your mind is totally still, you know, yoga says chitta vritti nirod. When the mind's activity is quietened, then you will see that within you, that chitta awakes and you are in tune with the universe through an experience of great bliss and joy. So it is empirically even today tested in labs, but this apart, it's too dry a concept. And so Hinduism showed its great adaptive skills. First, let me tell you that Adi Shankaracharya himself, although he believed in this great consciousness, which is adrishta, unseen, achintya, beyond thought, akhand, indivisible, nirgun, attributeless. It is nirvishesh chinmatram, undifferentiated, pure consciousness. He believed in that, but he divided knowledge itself into two parts. And very interesting. Paravidya, aparavidya. When you acquire that supra-transcendental knowledge which occurs from Brahm Anubhav, if you experience it, then it's another matter. But until you reach that, a preparatory stage is aparavidya, preparatory knowledge. In that preparatory knowledge, you can do everything you want. Prapatti, bhakti, yoga, puja, ritual, do anything. So long as it takes you further on that path. So Shankaracharya himself wrote the most moving devotional hymns to Shiva, to Parvati, to Vishnu, to Krishna. So that apart. But then there was a need to take Hindu philosophy further, because I just want to add one sentence. Hinduism, especially for the young, is a very cerebral religion. It is not a religion which is consisting of a series of commandments. It's about your thinking. So Ramanujam came up in the 11th century. And Ramanujam, while saying that Brahm is the ultimate reality, made the point that it cannot be completely attributeless, and that the infinite has also the capacity to create a shagun, nirguna shagun, a reality which has attributes. Now, what did it do? It gave to devotees, without denying the relevance of Brahm, the great personal comfort of a personal God, to whom you could go, to whom you could pray, to whom you could say. And you know, Hindus are harmonious schizophrenics. We go to a temple and we pray. And at the same time, we believe that, you know, that God is part of the ultimate consciousness. It is in him, it is in me, it is in all things animate and living. That's why they make a rock as a puja sthan. They can do it. Usme kya jata hai?
Pavan, may I just interrupt here because we have only 10-15 minutes, and the second part of this question is going to be very interesting for young people. One is a short question, which is that you spoke about yoga also as a possible path to meditation and so on. But you have given names of certain Indians like Jaggi Vasudev or Ramakrishna Paramahans, and also non-Indians who have attained this sense of consciousness intuitively, not through meditation. So that is one thing I wanted to ask you. So it can come all of a sudden, bang your head and you can become unconscious with it. That's number one. And the most important part of this is, we will come to it right away after you quickly finish this one, is validation by science. So that is what I would really like to talk about.
Your answer to your first question is that while knowledge is the path, the ways of that consciousness are unpredictable. Suddenly your antenna moves and you are in tune with that consciousness without having studied a single book on spirituality.
That is amazing.
That's called sakshatkar. It happens. It is aparoksh gyan, intuitively. It can happen to anyone. You mentioned Jaggi Vasudev. He was going in a motorcycle to the Chamundi Hills. He sat down to take a break and went into a trance for 7 hours. As he writes, it happens to some people. Suddenly, something moves in the cosmic world of consciousness. The antenna moves. You are in tune with that. Beyond all subjective categories, in a state of enduring joy, which you and I can be heir to. So it can happen.
Okay. Now we go to
because what you require for it, Latika, is not pandityam, not technical virtuosity. It requires balyam, childlike simplicity. Surrender yourself to the will of God. Meditate. And suddenly the antenna will move.
Well, we'll try. I wanted to go to that science of the chapter very much. Because when you talk of validation of all this by science, you are not speaking of stem cell technology, you're not speaking of aeroplanes, you're not speaking of nuclear power, as has been done recently. You're speaking about Adi Shankaracharya's structure of philosophical thought. And that structure is apparently being, that boundary is being accessed by today's scientists. And you quoted some very well-known names like Niels Bohr, Hawking, Max Planck, and so on, Einstein, that what they are actually moving towards in their study of cosmology, in their study of the infinite and so on, the Big Bang theory, the Big Crunch theory, which goes towards creation, preservation, and destruction, is very close to the way Hinduism has envisaged this universe. So I think validation by science is a very, very interesting subject.
I sometimes think that I am myself a schizophrenic between politics and the depths of Hinduism.
How you're balancing it.
So it's a two worlds that one inhabits. But to come to your question, you see, what is the nature of truth? Start with that. Today, scientists can discover it with telescopes, with scientific experiments, with mathematical equations. But equally, and I think this is what happened at the time of the Upanishads, you can also see it in deeply meditative and insightful moments without the support of this scientific scaffolding. So what our seers saw then and had the audacity of thought, as I said earlier, to say that it is basically a pure consciousness. It requires courage when you may take religion into spirituality, but without godhood. No God.
No God.
It's consciousness. Full of joy if experienced. So that insight and the elements of it, I found to my great amazement, are being validated by the most recent discoveries of science. I have a chapter in my book And I would recommend,
Yes.
I don't want to
That's
be a
why
salesman of my book because it has done rather well itself. Uh, uh, and is also published in Marathi, in Hindi, in Bengali, in Tamil, in Malayalam, and so on. The point is that there's a chapter there called The Remarkable Validation of Science. Now, it's a long chapter with a lot of detail. I can't go into it. But very briefly to say to you, what was the notion of Brahm? That it is infinite. Amatra. Today, cosmology is showing that the universe is infinite. I'll give you an example, Latika ji. And you see, light travels at the speed of 300,000 kilometers per second. The Milky Way, of which we are a part, is 300,000 light years across. Now, that is one galaxy. Your mind boggles. But according to cosmology, there are 125 billion such galaxies in the universe, each with at least 200 billion stars each, most of them bigger than the sun. Now, you can already imagine what are we looking at in our puny world, wondering when lunch will now eat. The universe. And now science cosmology is showing that this already gargantuan, unimaginable universe continue to expand every second at the speed of light. It's as if you take a balloon with dots on it and blow into it. The balloon and the dots will continue to separate from each other as the air goes in. So that's the example. So it is amatra. There's no big. Now, the notion of Brahm is that it is eternal. So scientists want to know, भाई कब शुरू हुआ, कब खत्म होगा? कोई तो beginning और end होगी, जैसे हमारी life की होती है, conventional life. Now they came up with the theory of the Big Bang, when an infinitely dense small speck, through the most remarkable inflationary expansion, at one finite time, at the most precise measurement of velocity, expanded into the universe. But now the same scientists are saying that if there could be a Big Bang, why can't one day the same film unwind leading to the big crunch? So it's exactly the notion of Brahm, that time cycle is anadi anand. There is neither beginning nor end. It continues. For instance,
Pawan, may I just interrupt you? I've been told there are only 5 minutes, and there were some questions. So,
I will end here for a variety of reasons in one sentence. Whether it is the intelligence of the cosmos, whether it is the interconnectedness of the cosmos, whether it is the whole notion of quantum physics which has changed the reality of the cosmos, exactly what Shankaracharya says, it's not what it seems to be, or whether it is the working of our mind which is essentially in tune with that consciousness. For a variety of reasons, what was said by our seers then is being validated today by science. And it's a very interesting chapter to
Very interesting. Now, here's a question by a student from the School of Liberal Arts. Her name is Suchetana, and she wanted to know what your thoughts were on the interchangeable use of Hinduism and Hindutva.
So long as Hindutva represents some of the remarkable complexities, nuances, and grandeur of Hindu civilization in all fields, art, culture, creativity, science, thought, spirituality, philosophy, metaphysics, I have no objection to it. So long as Hindutva reduces Hinduism to certain prescriptive precepts only and uses it politically to say only these are right and you are wrong, I think it's a great distortion of Hinduism.
There's a student called Mayub Sen from the School of Economics, and he asked what parallels can be drawn between Hinduism and other philosophies. In retrospect, do you think cultural philosophies have the same narrative? So what parallels can be
Cultural
drawn?
philosophies have, sorry?
What parallels can be drawn between Hinduism and other philosophies? He's asking that. And in retrospect, do cultural philosophies have the same narrative? That is what he's asking.
To some extent, yes, but there are vital differences. See, first, let me prefix my answer to you by saying that I truly respect all faiths. But being a Hindu, I have delved into the intricacies of Hinduism. What distinguishes Hinduism and the Indic faiths in general? Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, is that they are not about, I'm sorry I've used this word too often, but they are not about mandatoriness, that this alone is right. They are more about the search for truth in your own way, rather than about following only a certain path to reach it. Even for Hinduism, for instance, it's quite remarkable. There's no God, there's no book, only one book. But you can take the Bhakti path, Marg, you can take the Gyan Marg, you can take the Karm Marg.
Yeah.
So that freedom Hinduism allows. And at the level of thought, other cultural narratives also allow for interrogation, query, discussion, debate, and the exploration of truth. But that at the level of practice, perhaps Hinduism allows it far more. And that is why there is the tragedy that with this freedom given to us, and with such a tremendous menu to explore, Hindus don't know enough about their own religion.
I have the choice between ending it.
Just one interruption.
Yes.
The Chancellor would like to ask a question to
Surely,
Pawan.
sure.
Pawanji, namaste.
Namaste, sir.
In Mahopanishad, there is a concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And Symbiosis has adopted this as our motto. How relevant Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam concept is today?
I think it's extremely important, and Mazumdar Saab, it is the defining element of Hinduism in terms of its spiritual construct as well. It's one of a series of great sentences in the Upanishads. Ekam satya vipraha bahuda vadanti. The truth is one. Wise people call it by different names. Ano bhadra kritavo yantu vishvatah. Let good thoughts flow to me from all directions. Udara charitanam vasudhaiva kutumbakam. For the big-hearted, the entire world is our family, and Symbiosis has shown it in actual practice. This is the defining element of Hinduism. And I want to say to you that when these thoughts were formulated, they were nothing short of revolutionary. Because at that time, what people were saying is not that wise people call it by different names. This alone is the truth, and you must call it like that. At that time, people were not saying, Kritavayantu Vishvata, let good thoughts come to me from all directions. They were saying, build barriers, build walls. We don't want outside influence to come in. At that time, people were not saying the world is our family. They were saying that our own tribe is our only family. And look at the greatness of this religion's spiritual vision, that it could say, no, we embrace the whole world as part of one family.
Thank you, Pawan. I wanted to know if I should end it now and thank Pawan, or whether I should ask him this question which I spoke to you about when I was on the phone with you. Why is it that we believe that great wisdom resides only in the past and not in the present? This is Santosh Desai's article of 4 days ago. And I pointed this out to you. And I said, he asked this question, why is it that we always look to the past? There's wisdom even in the present. So is that
no, in the Indian context, there is. a specific reason why in the first 4,000 years of our foundational history, actually I'm writing currently a book on that, there was an atmosphere, an intellectual milieu for many social malpractices that occurred later, which encouraged the exploration of new horizons and led to distilled wisdoms, not only in thought, spirituality, metaphysics, but in social notions like I just said, dharma, artha, kam, moksha, the four stages of life, and so on and so forth. In political statecraft, in Kautilya's Arthashastra, Vatsyayan's Kama Sutra, in medicine, Sushruta, Charva, they wrote books on surgery, on Ayurveda, because that was the milieu. That was the milieu. Now what happened is that India suffered first under the Islamic invasion, although we later enriched ourselves by building in course of time a syncretic culture, but initially it was a great setback because the Muslim conquerors who came from abroad were foreigners and they were proselytizers and they were also very destructive. You know, when Nalanda burnt, and I'm not excavating the past for current day acrimony, we have to get beyond the past because we have built a republic now where all are included and have enriched it. But when Nalanda burned, it burned for months because of the repository of treatises and wisdom that was on it. The fire could not go out. So it has happened. There was a setback. And after that, with the coming of the British, this whole civilization was ridiculed. We became mimic men. We became photocopies of the West. Our aspiration was to become like them. We stopped original thinking. We stopped innovation, interrogation, query. And that is why so much of our wisdom is in the past. Unless, of course, you read my books.
In fact, I was about to end this session by saying thank you, Pavan, for your extraordinary scholarly, contribution to our understanding, and we are all leaving the session a bit better informed about Hinduism, as you made it a little more understanding. But I was going to say that behind all the scholarly facade of Pavan, there lies a great spirit of laughter and great spirit of fun. And I hope it comes out, and it came out, actually.
And one last word with Vidyaji's and your permission and Dr. Anita's permission. I want to tell the young, don't accept anything on face value. We were a great civilization and we can be. And please don't be beguiled by those who have become the new spokespersons of what you are and what our civilization should be. Question, because that is the birthright your past has given you.
Well, that is what Adi Shankaracharya told us, to question. He did it himself. And so hopefully all of us become small thinkers, not great thinkers like Adi Shankaracharya. Hinduism, small thinkers. Thank you very much, Pavan. Thanks.
Anita, before you take over, I want to ask Pavanji one question, or rather a suggestion, is that, with the new education policy that has been rolled out, it is specifically said that it should be a 21st century global education with deep-rooted Indian, values and all that. So all that you have spoken about was like music to our ears, but how do you bring in all this into the curriculum of an academic institution where students get to know, what our past is, what our civilization is, what our heritage is, and so on? Because we are so influenced by the West.
I'll tell you simply, I mean, if it's in the university, and I have some separate suggestions of pre-university level, in the university, you must have separate courses. You must have courses on Jainism, a remarkable religion, remarkable. It questions the Syadvad theory, questions everything. On Buddhism, the Shunyat concept is endorsed by science today. On Hinduism, on the grandeur of Islam. And what I'm trying to say is on Sikhism, you must bring this in. People should know. I can give in your university many lectures only on, for instance, Hinduism and its many facets. I mean, they have to. But it's a question of structuring it in. We ignore it. We don't know about it. And so we produce people who do the Dashera pujas. But if you ask them ki iske piche meaning kya hai,
Nobody.
they don't know.
Today's Navratri, nobody knows what it's for.
Well, Pawanji, I'm going to hold you to those last few sentences.
Anita, I was going to tell you exactly the same thing, that you must make sure that he comes and talks to your students.
And you'll be happy to know that we already have a few courses on religion and philosophy. And but I'm absolutely thankful for you for that absolutely mesmerizing and passionate conversation. And I think those words really resonate with me in terms of, a cerebral philosophy rooted in questioning, debate, and discussion. I also honestly cannot think of this conversation without having Dr. Latika Padgaonkar as your partner in this conversation, moderator. For the audience, she's a wonderful editor, translator, columnist, a PhD from the University of Sorbonne in Paris. She has taught at Pune's own Ferguson College and JNU, foreign correspondent for the Telegraph in Paris. She's worked with UNESCO, huge, but thank you so much, Latika ji. It was absolutely delightful to listen to both of you. For the audience, thank you so much for joining us.